and I would look at the mirrors and fantasize that I would just walk through the mirror into his world. Oh my god, thank god I did not have Twitter at the time. Grown adult, a writer, was in a relationship with a teenage girl. This has been the most heartbreaking book I've ever read. I've never cried this hard at a book. Hi and welcome back to my channel. Last week I came home to Omsk, where I have most of the books that I've accumulated in my 20 years of life. Well, some of them are in the UK right now, but almost all of them are here. So 20 years, not 20 years of reading, 12 years of reading, and they all are here. And I felt so nostalgic looking at all of them that I had an idea. At every age, almost at every age, I had a couple of favorite books, the books that I would read and reread, and they would leave such a strong impact on me. I wanted to talk about all of those books, so I started reading when I was 8, independently reading, I mean. So from that age, I'm going to tell you something about the books that I loved at every age. But also because I'm in Omsk, I have like horrible allergies. So if my voice sounds weird or if my face looks low-key like a pillow, you know why. I wasn't heavy drinking last night, I'm just swollen because of the allergies. Whatever. Okay, let's begin. The first book is obviously Harry Potter, and it's The Age of 8. Now I know what you're thinking, another Harry Potter adult. Well, technically yes, but no. Let me explain myself. I love Harry Potter, and I probably always will, and I love the universe and the franchise and everything, but I also do accept the very valid criticisms to the book, not even talking about the author. So I do acknowledge that there are flaws to this universe and the way it's written, and potentially because of who wrote it, but also for me, it's such a nostalgic thing. It's the first book that I ever read on my own. That is the book that my reading journey started with. I very clearly remember the moment when I was at this toy store, and I was at the section with books and magazines, and I would normally only choose the magazines with the stickers because at school we would exchange them and stuff. But then Harry Potter and Philosopher's Stone book caught my eye, and I picked it up, and I don't know why, but I bought it. Well, my mom bought it for me, but I picked it out for myself, and it was the first time that I independently chose a book. Because before it was my parents or gifts, but this was something that interested me. And I think I have this copy somewhere. Wait, let me find it. Yep. There it is. It is in Russian though. Most of these books up until the age of like 16 are in Russian because I was not reading bilingually confidently up until that age. So here's this book. It looks a little rough, but it traveled a lot with me. So the fact that it's still, how old is it? It's 12 years, yes. Wow. This book is 12 years. I remember how I came home and I was lying at the pillow fort that me and my sister built. And that was the moment, like, no one could kick me out of that pillow fort, but that book did. Basically, it was not enough light, and I was so captivated by the plot that I got out of the pillow fort and went to my top bunk, and I just started reading it. And I was reading page after page, so interested and so captivated by the story. I don't think I have to really explain the plot, because even if you haven't read Harry Potter, I'm pretty sure you know what the story is about, because it has been shoved at everyone for the past 20 years. And I know that it's a trend now to laugh at Harry Potter adults and ha ha ha, they need to grow up. Very funny, very original. But for me, that is my childhood memories, that is my childhood nostalgia, and it was such a huge part of my childhood. Also, fun fact, I never believed in like any magical creatures like the Tooth Fairy, the Santa Claus. I always knew that they were not real and I would exploit them low-key. But for some reason, at the age of 11, when I was not like a full-on child anymore, I actually waited for my letter from Hogwarts, convinced that there is not a single chance I'm not a wizard. Harry Potter was also the first book that I read in English, long before I could read bilingually. My parents gave me this set of Harry Potter books in English. I think I danced the concert, and at the end of the concert they gave it to me or something. I was 13 and I was struggling to read this book in English, but I used translator, I used everything I could, and I read all 7 books of Harry Potter in English at the age of 13, long before I knew how to properly read in English. Okay, 10 to 11. Here I will struggle with names because both of the series that I really loved, I don't think they had a proper translation to English. I don't think they had any translation to English. They had translation to, I'm not sure, by the way, I'm gonna put it on the screen. But the first one that I read when I was 10 to 12 was Часодей. And the closest, the best translation I can give you is the Time Wizards. It doesn't sound as good in English as it sounds in Russian. It is a book by a Ukrainian Russian-speaking author Natalia Sherba, and it follows the story of Vasilisa Ogneva. Vasilisa is a girl that is suddenly thrown into this world of magic, where time is a powerful source of it. It can be altered, you can fight with it, like you can do a bunch of stuff with it. Basically, time is the source of magic. And she's thrown into it when her dad, Norton Ognev, whom she hadn't known before that, suddenly reappears in her life, and he's like, yeah, I need you to come with me. So Vasilisa learns that she also has this magical time powers, that she belongs actually to the world Eflara, that is like this magic world. During her adventures on Eflara, Vasilisa gains friends, enemies in her quest to save the magical world Eflara from crushing into the ordinary world Astala, because there's some sort of like the apocalypse event or something, and she also has to uncover the secrets that the ancient artifact hourglass is hiding. A very fun plot. The series is 6 books, and when I tell you I could not put that book down to save my life, I think at some point I asked my mom to buy me the 5th one, and she did. And then she withheld it from me until I fixed my grades in one of the subjects because I just completely bailed on studying to read. That's how captivated I was by the story. This book was just the perfect combination of humor and drama and friendship and a little romance, because it's for like a younger audience, and the complexity of the plot and the themes and the descriptions and everything. I don't think that after Harry Potter I've ever been this attached to any other characters. Also, this was my first introduction to anything other than happy endings, because the ending was so bittersweet, I was shocked. Another book series that I don't think ever has been translated into English is Zertalia by Evgeny Gogloev. Again, the closest translation I can give you is The Mirrorland. Also doesn't sound as good. This book follows Katerina Державина, who moved to a new city with her grandmother and her stepmom. In the new city, she quickly finds herself trying to uncover some mystery, and that's how she finds out about the world on the other side of the mirror, called Mirrorland. And then she finds out that her and her parents are somehow connected to this world. As she learns more and more about it, she gets entangled in the very complex politics of that other world, and as every young adult main character does, she now has to save it from the apocalypse that is coming. One thing I remember I particularly liked about this book was just how descriptive it was. How I could imagine that Mirrorland world so clearly. This book is also for more older teenagers. I think it's good that I read it when I was closer to like 13, because the themes of interpersonal relationships, the drama is more complex, the plot is a little more complicated, and it has a little more romance. But also the themes that are raised, I don't think I should have like read them when I was 10. I don't think I would understand them when I was 10. This book also has my first ever proper book crush, and it was the main character's brother. His name was Alex, and I was so in love with him that I read 3 books that were adjacent to the franchise. I think I still have them. I don't remember a single plot point from those books, but I remember that I did read them. And I would look at the mirrors and fantasize that I would just walk through the mirror into his world. I was 13, piss off. 14 years old was when my self-esteem was at an all-time low. ignore that. But basically, that means I had ultimately no social life and I didn't really do anything outside of school, so I would just sit at home and read. So this age arguably has the largest number of favorite books. Geek Girl series by Holly Smale. It was my first foreign, young adult literature. And I will lie if I say that I did not think that, oh, I'm just like the main character. I was nothing like the main character. But in my heart, I wanted to believe that I was. So the series basically tells the story about this 15-year-old girl who's technically a geek. Her name's Harriet Manners, but then she finds herself becoming a model and being involved in the fashion industry and advertising, and now she has this supermodel career and super hot supermodel boyfriend, but she also has to manage life and teenagehood and growing up. And yeah, it was so entertaining but so silly. I'm gonna embarrass myself a little bit. Well, I already have, so whatever. In the book, she had this thing when she would get into a complicated situation, and then she would remember some fact, because that's how they showed her nerdier side. And she would remember this fact and it would save her. So me, being a copycat, I would just constantly read stuff like 100 random facts to make you seem smart. It never worked, but I just remember a bunch of different useless facts now. I think I finished the whole series because I think there's a billion books in them, but I read quite a few and I really enjoyed them. They were so light and humorous and easy to read, just overall great series. Here, I have to show you something. This is the book, Good Me, Bad Me. And does anyone else remember that Tumblr trend when you would just cover your book with white paper and you would make an aesthetically pleasing Tumblr cover yourself? I tried to do it with this book, and because I have zero artistic skills, it never worked, obviously. So now I just have a ruined book cover. So kids, don't ruin the covers of your books, you're gonna regret it. This book was the edgier side of me, and oh my god, thank god I did not have Twitter at the time. Because if I had Twitter when I was 14, I would have an embarrassingly documented past of having a billion quotes in my Twitter that say something like, every shy girl has the side that is just waiting to be pushed hard enough. Or something embarrassing like that. Thank God I did not have Twitter. I don't know what I would be doing if something like that was posted by me on the internet when I was a teenager. Side story, I only recently managed to delete my old TikTok from when I was 12 or 13, and thank God I looked younger because TikTok was like, nah, this girl doesn't look 13, delete. But it took me so long to do that and it was so embarrassing. The songs that I used, I just did not know what they were singing about. Ugh. But returning to the book. The plot follows this girl named Millie, and her mom is a serial killer awaiting trial. And Millie is the key witness. She is put into this foster family that is treating her really well, and they're so ready to give her a chance at a better life. But does Millie need it? Or is she just like her mother? Basically, the book raises the question of nature versus nurture. I remember just how captivated I was by the book and by the uncertainty of how the main character will turn out. Because I haven't reread it in a while, but if I remember correctly, the book did a great job at hiding how she will actually turn out. Maybe it was for me because I was 14, but I was intrigued. I don't think it's important to know that just because I read it at 14 doesn't mean that it's appropriate for 14 years old. I think it is a little mature for 14-year-olds. Also, I don't think that most of the topics of mental health and trauma were accurately and carefully illustrated and treated with enough caution. So read at your own risk, I would say that. Another one requires a preface. I do not really like romance books. I don't have anything against them, but I just don't really like them. It gets dull for me to only read about someone's romantic endeavors. But to contradict my entire dislike and everything I just said, one of my favorite books of all time that I actually read when I was 14 is Pride and Prejudice. I think my grandma gave it to me, and I read first few chapters without any particular interest, just not to disappoint her. And then, oh my god, I was invested. I think the fact that the romantic line represents something more than just the love story of two people is what caught me. The conflict of Pride and Prejudice and how masterfully and unobtrusively it was represented through the love line. That was so captivating to read, and I really enjoyed it. Also, Elizabeth Bennet is the perfect example of how to write a female character. I loved her. And this is something that lots of modern authors should actually read to stop, to read and study, to stop writing the one-dimensional, I am a strong and independent heroine characters that do nothing. And it's not for nothing that Mr. Darcy is technically considered the model for most of the male romantic interests nowadays. The last book is The Hunger Games. Okay, so here, again, I don't think I have to talk about the plot. Everyone knows the plot. Even if you haven't read it, you probably know it. I need to say two things. First of all, I am in no way trying to compete with my aunt on the love for Hunger Games. That woman is obsessed with it. I cannot count how many times she reread it, rewatched it, everything. I think her email has something to do with Hunger Games. That's the level of investment we're talking about. Secondly, it was just my comfort read, and I understand that, plot-wise, it raises some of very important, difficult topics, and what Susan Collins was inspired by while writing it is very important. But for me, it wasn't as emotionally taxing to require a specific atmosphere, perhaps because I was reading it quite young, and for me it was more of a fantasy series rather than a commentary on political and social situation. Now, when I'm rereading it, yes, it makes me think a lot more. But when I was at that age, I was just reading it when I needed a comfort read. So it became my comfort read, and I would just read and reread it, so it sort of became my favorite. At the age of 15, Outsiders was the book that I read and reread and reread and read over and over and over again. Something about the liveliness of the narration and the story itself just captivated me. The story follows a 14-year-old boy, Ponyboy Curtis. The society that he lives in is divided into greasers, the outsiders, and socks, the social ones with money and everything, and it talks about the social divide between them. The main character is proud to be a greaser, and he puts no thought into the problem of this division. However, when his friend Johnny actually kills a sock, that turns the main character's life upside down. He questions everything that he knows about life and morals and what's right and wrong, and he really struggles to navigate this divide that exists between the greasers and the socks in the society. It's a very powerful commentary on social class, judgment, and how people come together and unite when faced with struggles. At that age, I really enjoyed consuming media about the American South of 50s and 60s, and this is why I reread Huckleberry Finn with great pleasure, and also How to Kill a Mockingbird, but that was on the more serious side of reading, because that book is, I think it's also quite heavy when you read it. The two books that I really enjoyed reading at 16 are the following. The first book is something that I really enjoyed reading at the time, but when I learned more about how it was written and the story of the book itself, I would rather side with people who critique it now. I'm talking about the Memoirs of Geisha. Not a real memoir, by the way. The book is written in the genre of fantasy memoir, and it follows the life of Sayuri Nita. I really hope that I'm saying the name correctly. I practice with translator, but that thing is also not 100% sure. And I practice with a film, but whatever, I'm doing my best to say it correctly. She was a former famous geisha in Gyeon. The story follows her life from when she was sold by her parents to serve at the house to becoming one of the most famous geisha of the 1930s. Also covers the time when she was struggling during the war. If you read it like total fiction, not culturally, not historically accurate, It seems like a beautiful story. The descriptions are gorgeous and the narration is very nice, and all her adventures are explained in a very, very entertaining way. When you don't know much about that culture, the way it is explained does seem incredibly interesting, but it's just not accurate. As it often happens when people who do not practice the culture try to talk about the culture and integrate it into their art, they very often face the issue of it becoming not cultural representation rather than Orientalism, and overemphasizing the sex work in the profession of a geisha, just how it happened in this book. The whole thing was basically a misinterpretation of the profession of geishas. However, what almost completely ruined the book for me was how the author set up the woman that gave him all the information that he used. Miniko Iwasaki was the former geisha whom the author interviewed. According to her, he not only completely misinterpreted everything she said, based the story on her experiences without her direct consent, he also broke her anonymity that he promised her when he mentioned her in acknowledgements, and that caused her to receive a lot of hate in Japan. She was scorned by her peers, by other geishas, for participating in a book that misinterpreted their profession so much. The story is written very interestingly, and when I was reading it, I was like, wow, it is so interesting to learn about a culture that is so far from anything I know. And then you just find out that it's basically all wrong. So I enjoyed it, I loved it, I watched the movie, I read the book, it was great. But then when I learned it, my impression of the book was ruined. Another book that I loved at 16, which was also a memoir, I think I was on the memoir strike when I was 16, was The Castle of Glass by Janet Walls. Not so appropriate for a 16-year-old, I think, but I stole the book from my mom. This memoir is actually a real memoir. The memoir follows the life of this girl whose family had a nomadic lifestyle. Her parents never really had any jobs, and due to their financial responsibility, they had to travel from place to place a lot, and they never had a proper home, a proper education. They were just traveling all around, I think, the United States. They were moving very often, trying to take up any jobs, any opportunities, just to survive. They would live in trailer parks and abandoned buildings, and I think motels, and even in their car. The memoir was not only the recollection of those adventures, which were incredibly interesting to read about because it's such a lifestyle that you don't hear about too often in detail. But it was a very deep exploration of how the dysfunctional family dynamics and childhood trauma can follow you so far in life. Even when you're not a child anymore, you already started a life of your own, it still will follow you. I think when I was 16, I mostly enjoyed the adventures part and the detail in which the author explained every interesting story that happened to her. But when I reread it, I think a year ago, I enjoyed the deeper message of the book a little more. At the age of 17, I don't think I read much because it was my last year of high school, so I was preparing for my IB exams and I didn't really have much time to read. But one book that I remember I really enjoyed and that left a mark in my memory was Consent by Vanessa Springora. This memoir is a recollection of how when she was a teenage girl in France 30 years ago, how she was a muse of a much older, well-known author. And when I say muse, I mean that a grown adult, a writer, was in a relationship with a teenage girl. Vanessa Springora started speaking out on the topic of the sexual abuse of minors and how the French culture enabled that when she was a teenager. She started speaking out about it around the time of the 2019 Me Too movement, and then she wrote this book. This book really fell into my memory because of how clearly you can see the pattern, the details of how she was groomed by that adult. And what I also loved about this book was how she did not try to pander to the audience that demand the perfect victim. She did not try to present herself as this completely innocent in all elements of life teenage girl that was just doing her studying and everything, and then this complete monster showed up. Technically, it is this way. She was an innocent teenager, and he was a monster that a predator that groomed her and abused her. But what I'm trying to say is, she did not try to fit this narrative of how a victim should be so that her experience counts. And on the contrary, she helped to build the narrative that all teenagers and all children and all minors who faced abuse from adults are victims, regardless of their behavior. When I was 18, I had a gap year, so that was a very well-read year. At some point, I think the only thing I did was reading. So that was the age when I read A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I can see it right there. I'm scared to take it into my hands because I'm scared I'm just going to start to reread. This has been the most heartbreaking book I've ever read. I've never cried this hard at a book. Just watch this. Yeah. I think it has like the marks of my tears somewhere on the pages. Story follows four guys. Oh, okay, this is gonna be emotional. Jude, Willem, JB, and Malcolm and their lives in New York. We go through their different stages of life with them, watch them grow apart, find each other again, find love and success, suffer loss and tragedy. Basically, it is a memoir of their life. Not a memoir, it's, I don't know why I said that. It's just a recollection of their lives. I would argue that despite having four main characters introduced, the main character is actually Jude St. Francis. Oh, Jude, you did not deserve any of that. I don't know how to talk about this book without giving the spoilers, so I'm gonna be brief. Reading this book, I could not stop thinking about how unfair it is, how unfair life is to some people, and how she just gives them the worst cards ever, and they have to suffer throughout their entire life. But some people just don't become evil and angry because of that, and it's just incomprehensible for me. Everything that Jude had to go through, he was still a good person, and I could not read about how he believed every bad thing about him. How every time he was traumatized, the only thing he got from that was that it was his fault. He was the one to blame. Same thing with all the other characters. Oh, JB, if you've read it, you will understand it, but the forgive me lines were just, I think my heart skipped a beat when I first read that scene, and then the forgive me. When I finished reading this book, some points about the problematic message of this book started to make sense to me, kinda. The conversations about trauma porn and exploiting these experiences for the shock value were very interesting. And although I may not completely agree with them, the fact that this book brought this topic into conversation in the literature sphere is great. You can see just how many tabs I have, and they all mean something, and I very often come back to them and just reread them, and ugh. The second book was not much less heartbreaking. I would argue that perhaps it was even more heartbreaking, but it was more depressing and making you think. It was A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khalid Hosseini. Hope I'm saying this correctly too. I know that many people read this book after The Kite Runner, but I haven't read that one, so I don't know. Splendid Sons is a story about two Afghan women. Mariam, an illegitimate child who has been abused her entire childhood, and then married off to a much older man who was a shoemaker, and he was from Kabul. And Layla, a girl born to a seemingly more privileged life than Mariam, but when she suffers a very similar life tragedy to Mariam, she's forced to marry Mariam's husband, who's also much older than her. It's a very heavy story, and because it follows more than one generation, we could see how the already restricted lives of Afghan women were even more restricted when Taliban came into rule in Kabul. It's a story about resilience and the deep connection that was formed between these two women when they were forced to meet all these adversities in their lives. What I really loved about this book is how the author does not shy away from just how oppressive the Taliban regime was for everyone, but for women in particular. Also, the plotline of Mariam's first disdain for Layla as this younger and seemingly more loved wife that later turns into understanding and love and a bond was also beautiful and heartbreaking to read. This book did not make me outright cry, rather sit there and realize the tragedy afterwards and really think about it. Like, I don't know, I sometimes come back to the thoughts of this book, and when I watch something that is connected to that, it is a very heavy read that is going to stay with you. Moving on to the age of 19, which was last year. It is kind of against the rules of this video, but it's my video, so I make the rules. The books that I loved most at 19 were all from one author, and it's Rebecca Kuang. You can say I found my favorite author. I love her. I love her writing style. I love everything that she does. So the books that I loved by her were all the books in the Poppy War series and the Babel. I think it's like you can say it both ways. No, really, but from the most entertaining deep story about this girl who has a phoenix spirit inside and can literally burn her enemies, but also has to figure out whom to burn and to burn or not to burn, and how, like, what she should do while she's trying to navigate the complexities of the political games that creatures that are older than life playing. Oh my god, that was so interesting. I know that she's also often described as the ultimate unhinged girly. I don't like this simplification. She's unhinged, don't get me wrong, she burned an island. But I think it's an oversimplification of her character. And a heart-wrenching story about an orphaned boy who's taken in by some professor, who later turns out to be his dad, who's the biggest fucking asshole that doesn't give a crap about him, and how this boy has to navigate the elitist and not, I wanted to say low-key racist environment, but no, very racist environment of the Oxford and studying there and learning about how the silver work, which is some, like, it is the fantasy element in the book, how it's used to oppress like people in the colonies of Britain at the time, and how he has to, like, he fights between his pursuit of academia and the feeling of justice and his pursuit of restoring the justice. It was so good. The research that went into this book is insane. Like, that book did make me feel stupid though. Like, I was reading and I was like, how did she come up with that? Because I have everything prepared for me, written out for me, explained for me, but I struggled to understand it. How did she come up with that? The most recent book that became my favorite very quickly was Brother by David Charandi. A book that follows, it doesn't follow, it is more of like a retrospect to the life of two boys, two black boys that live in the suburbs of Toronto, in like an economically underdeveloped area. It's a tragic story about dreams and the dangers of dreaming and the awkwardness of grief and police brutality. Basically, the story is about two brothers, Francis, the older one, and Michael, the younger one. Francis has a dream of becoming a hip-hop artist, and Michael, his story is surrounded about his relationship, his first ever romantic relationship with his neighbor Aisha. The story begins, we meet Michael when he lives with his very fragile mother after his brother was killed. And she's going through the grief and she doesn't really process it yet, so she's in this very fragile state, and Michael welcomes Aisha into their house because Aisha's father had died and she wanted to come back to their neighborhood and maybe just, I don't know, process her own grief. I think this book is just everything. It's the coming of age, it's the boys becoming men, it's how you deal with very complex grief, how different people deal with grief, and how it's not always pretty, it's not always perfect, it's not always the way you want it to be. It also gives a very interesting, authentic outlook on the community at that place at the time. And obviously the topic of police brutality and the mistreatment of black teenage boys is raised throughout the entire book because, well, his brother was killed because of that. And I don't know, this book was, but it was just making me think a lot. I read it very fast because I was just so captivated by the read. And I think it stayed with me in a way that it talked a lot about grief, and I don't think I've read anything that explored this feeling in such detail. So yeah, that's it. These are all the books that were my favorites from the age of 8 to the age of 20. Maybe I'll read something that will become my new favorite book at the age of 20, I don't know. But from the time when I first picked out the book myself to now, these have been my favorite books. And I don't know, maybe some of these you also consider your favorites. If so, write in the comments. And follow, subscribe to my channel to see more content about books. And not only about books, because sometimes I just post random stuff about my life too.